In the last lecture, I showed you how to refactor fat case statements. But as your application grows and you introduce new actions, you'll end up with a fat reducer. You'll end up with a fat switch block with so many cases. We don't want to have 50 or 100 cases here. So when your application grows to that size, that's most definitely an indication that you need to break down your application into smaller and more maintainable parts or modules. So for this demo, I have created two modules. We have a new module called messaging, which has a very simple component. So this is not really a messaging module. We also have another module, tasking, which includes our to-do components. If you want to code along with me, you can download this application as a zip file. All right, now let me show you what to do when your application starts to grow and you will end up with a fat switch block here. So in the store, we have an interface that determines the shape of our application state. We have an object that represents the initial state of the application and a reducer. We want to replicate this structure in every module. So in every module, we want to have an interface that determines the state of that module. We want to have an initial state object and a reducer that is specifically designed for that module. So in our current implementation, we have 4 cases which are specifically for working with to-do items. And the other 2 cases are for our messaging module. So we want to break down this reducer into smaller, more maintainable reducer functions. So in our tasking module, I'm going to create 2 files, actions and store. Now I'm going to go in our original actions file. You can see here we have 4 actions that are specific to to-do items. So I'm going to take all of these and move them to this new actions file. Now let's go to our original store. I'm going to copy everything here and then paste it into our new store for the tasking module. Now let's modify this bit by bit. So here on the second line, we don't have increment and decrement actions because they belong to a different module. Delete. All right, now I'm going to change the name of this interface. I'm going to call this iTasking state. Now in our tasking module, we're only interested in these 2 properties, to-dos and last update. We don't care about new messages. So this interface is going to be simplified. Next, I'm going to rename this from initial state to tasking underline initial state. And it should be of type iTasking state. And once again, we don't need new messages here. Now I'm going to leave these helper functions here, like add to do, toggle to do, and so on. However, I'm going to delete increment and decrement. And finally, our reducer, we need to change this from iApp state to iTasking state. And it should return iTasking state. Very simple. So in our switch block, we're going to have only the first 4 cases. And I'm going to delete the last 2. And now we need to change the name of this function from root reducer to tasking reducer. And also, because we're going to have multiple reducers, we should initialize this state parameter. So we should set it to tasking initial state. This is a requirement by the Redux library. If you don't do this, you're going to get an error at runtime. Now let's go back to our original store and do some cleanup. So here on the top, we don't have these actions here anymore. We have moved them to the tasking module. So delete. Now I'm going to import iTasking state from tasking/store. And then I'm going to simplify iApp state interface, get rid of these 2 properties, add tasking, and set its type to iTasking state. So we're breaking down a big fat interface into smaller, more manageable interfaces. And then here, in the initial state, I'm going to set tasking to tasking initial state. And of course, we need to import it on the top. So from the same store, There you go. And we don't need last update here anymore. Next, I'm going to remove all these helper functions, except increment and decrement. We're going to move these to their own module. And finally, I'm going to simplify this root reducer. I'm going to remove these 4 cases. Beautiful. Now, before we proceed, I want you to pause the video and do the exact same refactoring for the messaging module. So define a store there and move all the code from our main store into the messaging store. So if you have done your refactoring properly, this is what your main store should look like. So here we have iAppState interface with 2 properties, tasking and messaging. This is how we initialize it. And finally, our root reducer should be empty. We don't have a switch block here. Now I'm going to go on top of this file and import a function called combine reducers from Redux module. Now we're going to delete this function here and instead export a constant, call it root reducer, and set it to the returned value of combine reducers function. This function takes a map object. With this map object, we map properties of our application state to their corresponding reducers. So our application state has 2 properties, tasking and messaging. So here I'm going to add a key value pair, tasking, and associate this with tasking reducer that we defined in our tasking store. And similarly, I'm going to add messaging and associate this with messaging reducer. This is how we combine multiple reducers, store the result into the root reducer, and return it. Now we need to import these 2 reducers on top of this file. So on the 3rd line, I'm going to import tasking reducer here and messaging reducer here. Beautiful. Now back in the browser, if you look at the console, you should see this error. In to-do dashboard component cannot read property length of undefined. Let's go to to-do dashboard component. First of all, we need to modify the path to the actions module because this is no longer in the root. This is inside this module. So we're going to get rid of this too. Now the reason for the error you saw is that our application state no longer has a property called to-dos or last update because we have put this under another property called tasking. So here we need to use an arrow function. S goes to s.tasking.todos. And similarly, S goes to s.tasking.lastUpdate. Save. Now we need to make the same change in other components. So to-do list. Once again, we need to change the path to the actions module. And then use an arrow function here. So S goes to s.tasking.todos. And finally, the same change in our messaging component. So change the path to the actions and an arrow function here. Like this. Let's test the application. So here's our messaging component. Beautiful. Let's add a few items here. Everything working properly. And this brings us to the end of this section. I hope you enjoyed this section and thank you for watching.